My mother kept a Bible on her nightstand her entire life. It was old and worn, and she read from it every morning and every evening without exception. When she passed away, I was the one who went through her room, and I was the one who picked up that Bible and held it for a long time before I could put it in the box with the other things I was keeping. When I did pick it up, something fell out from between the pages. It was small and metal, and it landed on the hardwood floor with a sound that was louder than it should have been in all that quiet. A key, not a house key or a car key, a small flat key with a bank logo stamped into the top and a number etched along the side. A safety deposit key, and the box it opened had been sitting in that bank for 30 years, waiting for someone to find it. Welcome to Grandma Payback Stories. I am Grandma, and today we have a story that begins in grief and moves through shock and lands somewhere that I would describe as the particular satisfaction of a secret that could not be kept forever, no matter how deeply it was buried. Before we get into it, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. New stories every single week, and this community is everything to me. Let us talk about Deborah, her late mother Elaine, and the father she thought she knew. Deborah was 51 years old when her mother Elaine died. Elaine had been 83, and her death was not unexpected. But it was still grief, the real kind, because knowing something is coming does not make the arrival any less hard. Deborah was an only child. Her father, Norman, was 79 and still living. He had been a prominent real estate attorney for 40 years before retiring. He was respected in his community, comfortable with money, accustomed to being the person in the room who knew how things worked. He and Elaine had been married for 55 years. Deborah had grown up in what she believed was a stable, loving, unremarkable household. Her parents had disagreements like all couples, but nothing dramatic, nothing that had ever made her question the marriage. Norman was reserved and precise, not warm exactly, but reliable. Elaine had been warmer, more openly affectionate, the emotional center of the family in the way that one partner often is. What Deborah found in that safety deposit box was evidence that her father had spent 30 years being a very different man when her mother was not looking. The bank branch where the key had come from was not the branch Deborah or her family used. It was across town, the kind of branch you would choose specifically because you were unlikely to run into anyone you knew there. Deborah drove there the morning after finding the key and presented identification and explained that her mother had recently passed and she was the executor of the estate, and she had found the key while going through personal effects. The bank process took about 40 minutes. They verified the key and her identification and her legal authority, and then brought her to the private viewing room and brought her the box. It was a large box, deeper than the standard size. Deborah opened it and sat very still for a moment before she started going through it. At the top were photographs. A woman Deborah did not recognize across many years in many places. The woman appeared in her 20s in the earliest pictures and in her late 40s in the most recent ones. There were also photographs of her father with this woman, the kind of photographs that required no interpretation. Norman in his 50s with his arm around a woman who was not his wife, in restaurants and hotel lobbies and what appeared to be a beach vacation. Norman in his 60s, same woman, older now. Norman looking, in all of them, lighter than Deborah had ever seen him in real life, more relaxed, freer, as if the version of himself he presented to his actual family was the performance, and these photographs were something closer to true. Below the photographs were documents, a lease agreement in Norman's name on an apartment across the city, 18 years of lease renewals. The most recent one dated 3 years ago, meaning the apartment had been maintained until Elaine's health had declined significantly enough that Norman no longer left the house often. Bank statements for an account Deborah had not known about, showing regular deposits and withdrawals that sketched the financial shape of a second life. Dinners, travel, gifts, rent, and something else at the bottom of the box, in a sealed envelope that had Deborah's name written on it in her mother's handwriting. Deborah held the envelope and understood that her mother had known. Elaine had known about the box, or known enough to put this envelope here, which meant she had known there was something in it worth leaving no response to. Deborah opened the letter with hands that were not entirely steady. Elaine's letter was for pages, written in the careful long hand of a woman who had been a secretary before her marriage and who had never lost the precision that work had given her. It was dated 11 years ago. Elaine had been 72 when she wrote it. She had found out about the affair when Deborah was 21. 30 years before the letter was written, she had found a phone bill with calls to a number she did not recognize, and had called it herself from a pay phone, the caution of a woman who understood even then that she was entering territory where she needed to be careful. The woman who answered had a name. Elaine had written it in the letter, Constance. She had spoken to Constance for minutes. Constance had not known Norman was married. She had believed for 7 years that he was widowed. He had told her Elaine was dead. Elaine had made a decision in the weeks after that phone call. She had decided to stay. She was 42 years old. Deborah was 21 and in college. They had a mortgage, a life, a structure that Deborah depended on. Norman was, in his way, a functional husband and father as long as you did not look too closely at certain hours. Elaine had confronted him. He had been shocked that she knew, then frightened, then remorseful in the way of someone who is primarily remorseful about being caught. He had ended it. He said he had promised. Elaine had not believed him completely, but she had chosen to proceed as if she did, because the alternative required more disruption than she was willing to cause to Deborah's world. She had also, quietly and methodically, begun protecting herself. She had consulted her own attorney without telling Norman. She had understood that she was married to a man who was capable of elaborate deception and that she needed her own legal and financial clarity. Her attorney had helped her establish documents, understand her rights, and put certain instruments in place that would protect her interests. The apartment, the box, the second account, these had continued. Elaine had known because she had watched for signs and found them. She had decided not to act on that knowledge while Deborah was young and while the disruption would have been most damaging. By the time Deborah was settled and Norman was older and the affair had presumably wound down with age, Elaine had concluded that disturbing the settled surface was more costly than it was worth. But she had not wanted it to disappear. She had not wanted Norman to be the only one who knew the shape of what he had done. She had put her letter in his box because she had found the key ones years ago and made a copy before he noticed it was missing. She had put it there so that when the box was eventually found, the truth would be found with it. She ended the letter this way: I am leaving this for you, my darling, because you deserve to know who your father is. Not so that you will be angry on my behalf, because I made my peace with this long ago, but so that you will never make the mistake of trusting him with something that matters, and so that you will know that your mother was not a fool. She was a woman who chose her battles carefully and won the ones she fought. Deborah sat in her car in the bank parking lot for a long time after leaving the viewing room. She had the photographs and the documents, and her mother's letter, and she sat with all of it, and felt the particular dislocation of someone who is just learned that the ground they thought was solid was not where they were standing at all. She thought about who she was going to tell first. She called her own attorney, not because she was certain of her next step, but because she was her mother's daughter and she understood that before you make a move you get clarity on your position. Her attorney reviewed everything and identified several things of legal relevance. The account Norman had maintained for 30 years had been funded, at least in part, from business revenues that had also been the subject of their shared marital finances during the decades of their marriage. This was potentially recoverable as dissipated marital assets, except that Elaine was now dead and the marriage was technically ended by death rather than divorce. The estate, however, was another matter. Norman had been listed as sole heir under the will, which was standard after 55 years of marriage, but if it could be demonstrated that he had fraudulently misrepresented financial information throughout the marriage, concealed assets, and diverted marital resources, there were grounds to challenge the estate distribution and potentially require an accounting of what had been taken over 30 years. Deborah asked her attorney what she thought they could actually recover. Practically speaking, her attorney said that was the wrong question. She said the right question was what Deborah wanted, and that the legal tools were in service of that answer, not the other way around. Deborah thought about what she wanted. She thought about her mother at 40 to finding out her husband had told his mistress she was dead. She thought about her mother spending 30 years knowing, staying quiet for Deborah's sake, writing a letter 11 years ago and putting it in a box. She thought about the photographs of her father looking happier in his second life than he had ever looked in the one she was part of. She knew what she wanted. She called Norman and asked if she could come over for dinner. He said of course. He was always glad to see her. She said she had been going through her mother's things and had some questions. He said of course, whatever he could do to help. He did not know she was coming with the box. She brought a copy of everything to Norman's house on a Wednesday evening. She brought her attorney's letter outlining the legal basis for a full accounting of the estate assets and an investigation into funds diverted from the marital estate. She brought her mother's letter, copied the original safely with her attorney. She brought the photographs, not because they were legally relevant but because she felt her mother had kept them for 30 years and they deserved to be seen by the person they documented. She laid all of it on his kitchen table while he was still standing in the doorway to the dining room. He looked at it for a long moment and then sat down heavily in his chair. He did not try to deny it. He was 79 years old and he had known this moment existed somewhere, and he had spent 30 years hoping it was far enough away that it would never actually arrive. He said, "Your mother knew." Deborah said, "She did. She left you a letter. She put it in your box." He looked up at that. Something moved across his face. Grief, real grief, of a kind Deborah had not expected. Whatever he had felt for Elaine, it had been real in its own way, which was perhaps the saddest part of the whole thing. The legal process was not quick. Norman's attorney argued, as expected, that the estate should pass per the will, that there was no fraud in the formal sense because Norman had not concealed assets from Deborah specifically, and that the marital dissipation claims were complicated by the time elapsed and the method of funding. Deborah's attorney argued back, methodically and with complete documentation. The settlement reached after 8 months of negotiation resulted in Deborah receiving a significantly larger portion of the estate than the will alone would have provided. The legal logic was complex, but the emotional logic was simple. Norman had diverted resources from the marriage for 30 years. Those resources had diminished the estate that Elaine would otherwise have built, and Deborah, as Elaine's heir, had a claim on what should have been there. Norman continued living in the house. He was not destitute, but the comfortable surplus he had expected to carry him through his final years was considerably reduced. He and Deborah had a careful, limited relationship in the years that followed. She saw him at the holidays. She called on his birthday. She did not pretend that nothing had happened, and she did not perform warmth she did not feel. She put her mother's original letter in a frame, not to display it, but to preserve it. She keeps it in a drawer, where she can find it easily, and she takes it out sometimes and reads it. Particularly the last part. She was a woman who chose her battles carefully and won the ones she fought. Deborah thinks about that. She thinks her mother was right about herself, and she thinks she learned something from the example, which is that patience and documentation and the right moment are often more powerful than the loudest possible response to an injustice. Elaine had waited 30 years for the right moment. The right moment had been the box. Subscribe to Grandma Payback Stories and hit that like button if this story moved you. Leave a comment below and tell me about Elaine. Tell me about that letter. Tell me whether you think she made the right choice staying all those years. I do not think there is one right answer, and I want to hear yours. I read every comment, and new stories are here every week. I will see you in the next one.